The coins hit the counter with a sound like a gunshot, and every man in Graves' trading post went dead silent. Myrtle Hawkins stood with her chin raised, her dark eyes cutting straight through Gilbert Graves like he was made of smoke, and she was the wind that scattered it. She had just done something no man in the Wyoming Territory had managed in 3 years of trying. She had outbargained him. She had taken the hide he priced at $4.50 and walked away with it for $2.80, plus a tin of saddle oil thrown in for free. And she had done it with nothing but arithmetic, nerve, and a gaze that could strip paint off a barn door. Gilbert Graves stood very still behind the counter. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark auburn hair that curled at the temples from years under a sweat-dampened hat. His hands were flat on the wooden surface and his jaw was tight, and Myrtle could see the exact moment that he decided he was not angry. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, and the way the corner of his mouth pulled sideways. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than a smile. He looked at her for a long moment. The other men in the post, 3 cowhands from the Belmore Ranch, an old trapper named Sven who smelled like pine resin and bad decisions, and the sheriff's deputy who had come in to buy a paper of tax, all waited to see what Gilbert Graves would say. Because Gilbert Graves always had something to say, and it was always the last word, and it always landed. He said, "You can come back any time." Not sourly, not as a warning, not as a dismissal. He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying around without knowing it, like a stone in his boot he only just noticed. He said it like an invitation that surprised him as much as it surprised her. And then he turned and went into the back room, and the creak of the door swinging shut behind him was the loudest sound in the Wyoming Territory. Myrtle picked up her parcel. She tucked the tin of saddle oil under her arm. She walked out into the bright May morning of 1879, and she did not look back, because she had learned a long time ago that looking back cost you everything. But she thought about those words for the entire 4-mile ride back to her land claim. She had not meant to go to Graves' trading post at all that morning. She had meant to go to Hutchinson's dry goods on the eastern edge of Caldwell Creek, which was the town she had been living near for 6 months. Since she had filed her homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862 and put her name on 160 acres of wind-scoured Wyoming grass that nobody else had wanted because the creek that ran through it only ran reliably for 8 months of the year. Myrtle Hawkins had looked at that creek, and the 2 months it went thin and thought, "I can work with that." Because working with things that other people gave up on was more or less the whole story of her life. She had been born in 1854 in Missouri, the second of 6 children, to a father who ran a small freight operation and a mother who kept the books for it, and who had taught Myrtle the books before she taught her anything else, on the grounds that numbers would keep you alive when beauty faded and charm ran dry. Her mother had been a practical woman in the way that frontier women had to be practical, not hard, but efficient, with love stored in the same careful places she stored everything else, because waste was a luxury they couldn't afford. When Myrtle was 20 years old, she had married a man named Edmund Hawkins, who was 24, handsome in an uncomplicated way, and genuinely kind. She had loved him the way you love something you built together, with investment and attention and the daily practice of choosing it. They had moved to Kansas together, chasing a land opportunity Edmund's brother had written about, and for 4 years they had made something good out of difficult circumstances. Then Edmund had gotten sick with the lung fever that swept through the settlement in the winter of 1878, and he had been gone by February, and Myrtle had been 24 years old and a widow with no children, no family nearby, and 160 acres of Kansas that she couldn't manage alone and couldn't bear to stay on. She sold the Kansas land. She took the money and she moved north, because moving felt better than staying still when everything still felt like grief, and she filed her claim in Wyoming, and she spent 6 months building something stubborn and hers out of that wind-scoured grass and that unreliable creek. Hutchinson's dry goods had been closed when she arrived on that Tuesday morning in May. A handwritten sign in the window said "Closed for family business," which in Myrtle's experience could mean anything from a birth to a funeral to a particularly compelling card game. She had sat on her horse for a moment, recalculating, and then she had turned toward the trading post at the far end of town because she needed the saddle oil and she needed the cured hide for the door lining she was making, and she was not going to ride 8 miles round trip for nothing. She had heard about Graves' trading post, of course. Everyone in Caldwell Creek had heard about it, and everyone had an opinion about Gilbert Graves, and most of those opinions were delivered with a particular combination of respect and exasperation, the way people talked about things that were inconveniently good at what they did. He was fair, people said. Fair but immovable. His prices were set by a system that nobody fully understood and everybody suspected was designed to take them for exactly as much as they could afford to pay. He had a memory for prices and quantities that bordered on supernatural, and he had never, in 3 years of operating in Caldwell Creek, lost a negotiation. Until that Tuesday in May, when Myrtle Hawkins walked through his door. She had not gone in planning to negotiate. She had gone in planning to buy the hide and the oil at whatever price they were marked, because she had a budget and she respected it, and she generally found that people who spent their energy haggling over small amounts of money were people who hadn't found better uses for their energy. But then she had looked at the price marked on the hide, and she had looked at the comparable quality of the hide, and she had done the arithmetic quietly in her head the way her mother taught her, and the arithmetic had told her that the price was wrong. Not maliciously wrong, just wrong. So she had pointed it out politely, with specifics. Gilbert Graves had told her she was mistaken, also politely. She had told him she was not mistaken and produced the arithmetic, out loud, in front of everyone. He had countered. She had countered back. He had tried a different approach, citing scarcity of the particular grade of hide. She had pointed out that the Belmore Ranch had brought a full load of hides to market 2 weeks ago, which she knew because she had seen the wagon herself on the road, and that scarcity was therefore not a credible argument. He had looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, somewhere between irritation and something that was starting to lean dangerously toward respect, and then he had adjusted the price to $2.80, which was precisely what her arithmetic had suggested was fair. And then she had looked at the tin of saddle oil on the shelf behind him and said simply, "The oil comes with it." It was not really a question. It was the kind of statement that could only be made by someone who had already done the calculation that the negotiation had cost him enough good faith to afford the oil, and who knew that he knew it too. He had looked at her for a long, measuring moment. And then he had taken the oil off the shelf and set it on the counter. Myrtle rode home through the May morning with the dry prairie wind pulling at the brim of her hat, thinking about arithmetic and about the way Gilbert Graves had said you can come back any time in that voice that sounded like something he hadn't meant to say out loud. She put him out of her mind. She had 3 acres of the south field to turn before the ground hardened, and a fence line that needed mending on the north boundary, and a roof on the small barn she had built that was showing signs of wanting to let in rain. She had enough to occupy her mind without adding a trading post proprietor to the list. She lasted 11 days before she needed to go back. The fence mending had required more wire than she had on hand, and the trading post was where the wire was, and that was a practical matter with no romantic significance whatsoever. Myrtle was very clear with herself about this, as she rode into Caldwell Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of May, with a list in her pocket, and no intention of doing anything other than purchasing the items on that list at reasonable prices. The trading post was busy when she arrived. 3 women were looking at bolts of fabric near the front window, and a man she didn't know was waiting at the counter with a pair of boots in his hand. Gilbert Graves was wrapping something in brown paper with efficient hands while talking to the man about the boots, something about sole leather, and the relative merits of different tanneries. And he did not look up when the bell above the door rang. He looked up when she was halfway to the hardware section, though. She felt it before she saw it, the particular weight of being watched by someone who is trying to do it without appearing to. And when she glanced over her shoulder, he was looking directly at her. He didn't look away quickly. He just nodded, once like a man acknowledging something he'd been expecting. She nodded back and found her wire. She brought it to the counter when the man with the boots had gone. Gilbert was writing something in his ledger book, and he finished the line before he looked up, which she found herself appreciating rather than resenting because she understood about not losing your place. "Wire," he said. 50 yards, she said, and a box of staples. He got the staples from under the counter and set them beside the wire. He named the price. She checked the arithmetic in her head and it was correct, so she paid it, and he wrote it in the ledger. "How's the claim coming?" he asked, which surprised her because she hadn't realized he knew she had a claim. "Well enough," she said. "The south field is hard going, but the soil is good once you're through the top inch. That's Caldwell Creek Basin land," he said. "You'll have alkali trouble if you push too far north." "I know," she said. "I've been testing the soil since March." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she had seen during the negotiation, the one she still couldn't fully name. "You test the soil yourself." "My mother kept the books for my father's freight operation," Myrtle said. She believed in knowing things before you needed them. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. Gilbert Graves was not a man who communicated dramatically. But something loosened very slightly around the eyes. "That's a practical philosophy," he said. "It served her," Myrtle said, "and it served me." She picked up her wire and her staples. She said good afternoon and she left. And this time when she rode home, she was thinking about soil alkalinity and fence posts and the logistics of the south field. And only incidentally about the way he had said that's a practical philosophy, as though it was something he agreed with personally and had been waiting to hear someone else say. The third time she went to the trading post was 3 weeks later, in early June, and it was not for supplies. She had heard, through the particular efficient information network that operated in small frontier towns, through a combination of post office conversation and church porch gossip, that there had been an incident at the trading post involving a man named Deckard Foss, who was a land speculator operating out of Cheyenne. Deckard Foss had come to Caldwell Creek with money and a legal team and a strategy that involved purchasing distressed homestead claims from settlers who had hit their first bad year and didn't have the reserves to survive it. It was not illegal, strictly speaking, what Foss did. But it walked very close to the edge of illegal in the way that certain things do, the way that a trap can be perfectly legal right up until the moment something is caught in it. He identified settlers who were behind on their improvement requirements. The Homestead Act required claimants to improve the land within 5 years or forfeit it, and he offered them cash payments for voluntary assignment of their claims. The cash was always less than the land was worth. The settlers, panicked and cash poor and sometimes genuinely desperate, often took it. What Myrtle had heard was that Foss had come to Graves' trading post and attempted to use the post's credit accounts as leverage. Foss had apparently purchased several of those accounts from settlers who owed Gilbert money, which he was legally entitled to do, and had then offered Gilbert a business arrangement essentially. Foss would forgive the debts if Gilbert would share information about which of his customers were in financial trouble. Gilbert Graves had, according to several independent accounts, told Foss exactly what he could do with that proposition, in language that was apparently quite specific, and that the post office gossip rendered only in euphemism. What Myrtle had also heard, from a source she considered more reliable, was that Foss had not left town, and that he was watching the trading post in a way that made people uncomfortable, and that he had made a remark to someone at the saloon about making that stubborn man regret his mouth. Myrtle told herself that this was not her business. She told herself this several times over 2 days while she worked the south field and mended the fence and watched the sky for rain. On the third day, she rode into town and tied her horse in front of Graves' trading post and walked in. Gilbert was alone except for a young man named Charlie who worked for him part-time, who was sweeping the far end of the room with the focused determination of someone who knew something was wrong in the atmosphere and was trying to be helpful by staying out of it. Gilbert looked up when she came in, and something in his expression did something that she filed away to think about later. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said. "I heard about Foss," she said, because she didn't have the patience for a long approach. He was quiet for a moment. "Word travels," he said. "Word always travels in a town this size," she said. "What are you planning to do about it?" He looked at her steadily. "Nothing I need help with," he said. "That's not what I asked," she said. "I asked what you were planning to do." He was quiet again, longer this time, and she had the sense that he was deciding something, a calculation about how much to say and to whom. She waited. She had learned that patience in a negotiation, any kind of negotiation, was worth more than most other skills because most people filled silence with more than they meant to. "Foss owns paper on 7 accounts," Gilbert said finally. "He can call them in or assign them or use them however he wants. That's legal. I can't stop that." He paused. "What I can do is work with those 7 people directly to get ahead of whatever Foss is planning, so they're not caught in it." "Have you talked to them?" "Working on it," he said. "Then let me help," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite surprise, but something that lived between them. "Why?" "Because Foss is doing the same thing to homesteaders on the creek basin that he's trying to do to your accounts," she said. "Because 3 of my nearest neighbors have already had his agents come to their doors with cash offers and legal-sounding language. Because what he's doing is a kind of trap, and traps work best when people don't see them, and I see it." Gilbert studied her for a long moment. Charlie swept very carefully at the far end of the room. "All right," Gilbert said. "Sit down." She sat in the wooden chair beside the counter, and he pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, and they spent the next 2 hours building a plan that was practical and legal and extremely effective. What Myrtle knew, and what she contributed, was the legal language of the Homestead Act itself, which she had read in full before filing her claim and reread twice since, because knowing things before you needed them was her mother's philosophy, and she had inherited it completely. She knew the specific provisions about improvement requirements, about the definition of continuous residence, about the documentation that proved a valid claim. She knew that several of the settlers Foss was targeting were more secure than they believed, because they didn't understand what counted as improvement under the law. What Gilbert knew was his customers, not just their debts but their situations, their strengths, the specific shape of each person's trouble. He knew which of the 7 account holders were panicking and which were steady. He knew which ones would respond to practical information, and which ones needed to hear that someone was on their side before they could listen to information at all. Between them, they had a plan that addressed both. Myrtle rode home that evening when the sun was getting long and orange over the western bluffs, and she was aware of something different in herself that she couldn't quite name, a kind of aliveness that felt different from the competent, purposeful aliveness of managing her claim alone. This was something warmer, something that involved being matched. She put that thought away too. She had a lot of thoughts she was putting away, which was beginning to require active management. Over the next 3 weeks, Myrtle and Gilbert worked together to reach all 7 of the affected settlers. They did it quietly, without fanfare, in a way that didn't draw Foss's attention before they were ready. Myrtle rode out to the creek basin homesteads and talked to her neighbors in the practical, warm, specific way her mother had talked to everyone, explaining what their claims actually meant, and what they were actually worth, and what Foss was actually offering, which was considerably less than both. Gilbert handled the 3 accounts that were within town, and he renegotiated payment terms with his own customers in ways that removed Foss's leverage entirely. By the end of June, Deckard Foss left Caldwell Creek with none of the claims he had come for. He left in a particular kind of fury, the fury of a man who has been outmaneuvered without being able to identify exactly how or by whom, which is the most infuriating kind of loss. He made a remark at the livery stable about unfinished business, which the livery stable owner repeated to approximately everyone within 48 hours. Myrtle heard it. She filed it. She kept an eye on the horizon. She was at the trading post on the morning of the 1st of July when she heard it. She had come in early before the usual morning traffic to return a book she had borrowed. Gilbert had a shelf of books behind the counter, a small and eclectic collection, and she had noticed a copy of a particular agricultural survey she had been wanting to read, and he had told her to take it. In the offhand way he said most things, as though generosity was a habit so ingrained it didn't require commentary. She had brought it back with 3 pages of notes she had taken on the sections relevant to the creek basin soil. He was reading the notes when Charlie came in from outside moving fast, with the particular quality of movement that means news and not good news. Foss had not left. Or rather, Foss had come back, and he had brought 2 men with him, and those men had spent the previous night pulling survey stakes on the Hennessy claim on the south edge of the creek basin. The Hennessys were young. Tom was 23 and Clara was 22, married 18 months ago, with a baby due in September, and they were one of the 7 claims Myrtle and Gilbert had worked to protect. But pulling survey stakes was not an economic attack. It was something more directly physical, more immediately threatening, and it was designed to frighten people who had already been frightened back into the kind of panic that made bad decisions feel like the only option. Gilbert was already moving. He took his coat from the hook by the door. He looked at Myrtle with the directness she had come to understand meant he was thinking fast and treating her as a peer in that thinking. "The county surveyor is in town this week," she said, because she had seen the surveyor's wagon at the hotel the previous afternoon and filed the fact without knowing yet why it would matter. He stopped moving. "You're sure?" "I saw his equipment through the wagon slats," she said. "Brass transit, chain case." "It's a surveyor. If we get the surveyor to the Hennessy land before Foss can document his altered stakes," Gilbert said, "the original record stands. And if the original record stands, the interference becomes evidence of criminal interference with a federal land claim," he said. They were both already out the door. What happened that morning was not dramatic in the way that frontier stories are sometimes dramatic. There was no gunfight. There was a great deal of fast riding and some very tense conversation with the county surveyor, a methodical man named Harrison who had been eating his breakfast, and who was persuaded by a combination of Gilbert's credibility as a local businessman and Myrtle's specific, well-documented knowledge of the exact language of the federal land statutes to come immediately to the Hennessy claim and document what he found. What he found was exactly what Myrtle and Gilbert expected. Foss's men had moved 3 of the corner stakes, which the surveyor documented precisely, and the original claim monuments were still visible in the turned earth as disturbances in the grass. Harrison wrote a precise and damning report. Foss was gone from Caldwell Creek by sundown, this time with the specific additional pressure of a federal surveyor's documentation of interference with government-registered land. Tom and Clara Hennessy stood outside their sod house that afternoon and Clara cried, which she immediately apologized for, and Tom shook Gilbert's hand for a long time without speaking. He shook Myrtle's hand too, which she accepted with a nod, because she understood what the handshake meant. On the ride back to town, the late afternoon sun was doing something spectacular with the high clouds over the bluffs, and Gilbert pulled his horse alongside hers and they rode in silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't empty but is full of things that haven't been said yet. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't a small thing for him to say. She could tell by the care with which he said it. "Thank you for letting me help," she said. Another silence. Their horses walked easily together, matching stride. "You knew about the surveyor," he said. "That wasn't luck." "No," she said. "My mother called it preparedness. I call it paying attention." "Either way," he said, "it made the difference." She looked at the bluffs. The clouds were going orange and deep pink at their edges. "Your prices," she said, which was not a natural continuation of the conversation but was something she had been thinking about. He looked at her sideways. "What about them?" "They're not arbitrary," she said. "I've been watching them for 2 months. They track with the Cheyenne market reports but adjusted for freight time and spoilage and the specific credit risk of the customer. It's a system." He was quiet for long enough that she glanced at him. "Nobody's noticed that before," he said. "Plenty of people have probably noticed," she said. "They just don't say things." "You say things," he said, and his voice had something in it that she was not going to look at too closely yet. "My mother believed that saying accurate things was a form of respect," Myrtle said. "Pretending you haven't noticed something in order to be polite is a way of treating people as though they can't handle what's true." He looked at her for a moment longer than a sidelong glance technically required. "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked to know," he said. "She died 4 years ago," Myrtle said. "Fever. She would have liked you too." She said it simply, the way she said everything, and then she was a little surprised she had said it, and she looked back at the road, and the silence that came after was different from the silences before it. Fuller, warmer. The kind of silence that means something has been placed on the table between two people and now they have to decide together what to do with it. Nothing was decided that evening. They reached town and she went back to her claim and he went back to the post, and that was all. But over the following weeks of July, things shifted between them in the way that things shift when two careful people have put something important on the table and are circling it with a kind of deliberate attention. He started leaving things for her when he knew she was coming in. Not conspicuously, nothing that could be called courting in any obvious way. A specific grade of seed corn that he'd sourced from a supplier in Laramie when she'd mentioned in passing that she was thinking about a small crop trial. A pamphlet from the land-grant university about soil amendment that he had ordered from back east. Small, specific things that said, "I am paying attention to what you're doing," which is a more intimate form of attention than flowers or compliments, because it requires actually listening. She left things for him too. Notes, sometimes, about prices she had seen quoted in the newspaper from Denver that might affect his buying decisions. Once, a jar of the creek plums she had put up, because she had a good plum year and she had made more than she needed, which was a practical reason and also not the whole reason. He put the jar of plums on the shelf behind the counter and didn't move it. In August, he asked her to dinner. He did it the way he did most things, directly and without preamble, which she had come to understand was not brusqueness but a form of respect. He didn't pad things with social cushioning that implied she needed to be managed. He said, "I'd like to take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant on Saturday if you're willing." And she said, "Yes, I'm willing." And that was that. The hotel restaurant in Caldwell Creek was a modest place. 4 tables with actual tablecloths, a menu that changed based on what the cook could get fresh, and candles that were functional rather than romantic but managed to be romantic anyway because the light they threw was warm and forgiving of silence. Myrtle wore the dark blue dress that had been her good dress for 3 years, because it was the best she had, and she wore it because this mattered, not because she wanted to impress him, but because she wanted to show up with her whole self for something that she was beginning to understand was important. He was already at the table when she arrived. He stood when she came in, which was manners but also felt like something beyond manners. He had made an effort. His shirt was clean and pressed, his hair was combed back from his temples, and he had shaved recently enough that his jaw was smooth. He looked, she thought, like himself but on purpose, which she found enormously appealing. They talked through dinner with the ease of people who have been building a conversation for 3 months and are finally in a room without practical tasks to organize it around. She learned things she hadn't known, that he had come to Wyoming from Ohio, where his family had run a dry goods store for 2 generations, and that he had wanted to build something that was his rather than inherited, which she understood completely. That he had been in Caldwell Creek for 4 years, 2 of them alone before he opened the trading post, doing freight and odd work and learning the country. That he had a younger sister in Columbus who wrote letters he answered conscientiously every 2 weeks. He learned things about her, about Edmund, which she told him plainly, because honesty about grief is not the same as being consumed by it. About Missouri and her parents. About the specific sequence of decisions and not quite accidents that had brought her to a 160-acre creek basin claim in Wyoming with an unreliable creek and a barn roof that still needed attention. "You're not afraid of hard work," he said, and it wasn't a compliment so much as an observation, which made it more meaningful. "I'm not afraid of most things," she said. "I'm cautious, which is different. Fear makes you contract. Caution makes you precise." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one from the very first day, the one she had been trying to name for 3 months, and she thought she was close to a name for it now. It looked like recognition. It looked like a man who had given up expecting to find something specific and had suddenly, unexpectedly found it. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "I'll tell you if I'm not answering." "The day you came in and beat me on the hide price," he said. "Was that planned?" she considered. "Not the negotiation itself," she said. "I didn't go in planning to negotiate. But the moment I saw the price was wrong, I said so, because saying things that are true is how I operate. What surprised me," she added after a pause, "was that you didn't get angry." "I wasn't angry," he said. "I know," she said. "Why not?" He thought about it. "Because you were right," he said, and because he stopped. "Because," she said. "Because it was the most interesting thing that had happened in the trading post in a year," he said. "Maybe longer," she smiled, which she didn't do carelessly. When Myrtle Hawkins smiled, it meant something, and he looked at her like a man who understood that. After dinner, they walked down the main street of Caldwell Creek in the warm August night, not quite touching but close enough that the possibility of it was its own kind of warmth. The stars were very bright out here, far from any city, and the night smelled like dust and sage and something faintly sweet from the cottonwoods along the creek. "I want to see the claim," he said. She looked at him. "Not tonight," he said, with the faintest edge of dry humor that she had learned was how he laughed. "I mean in the daylight. I'd like to see what you've built." "Come Sunday," she said. "I'll make coffee." "I'll bring the beans," he said. "The Guatemalan ones just came in from Cheyenne. They're worth the trouble." He walked her to her horse. He stood close enough that she was aware of him the way you're aware of something warm in a cool room, and he looked at her with the specific seriousness of a man about to say something he has carefully decided to say. "I told you the day you first came in that you could come back any time," he said. "I remember," she said. "I want you to know I meant it," he said, "and not only as a customer." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. "I came back, didn't I?" He was quiet for a moment, and then that corner of his mouth moved in the not-quite smile that she had, over the course of 3 months, come to find deeply affecting. She rode home under the brilliant August stars thinking about how it felt to be seen, not performed for, not managed, not handled, but genuinely, attentively seen, and how long it had been since she had felt that, and how it felt different this time than it had before. Not worse, just different, her own thing. New. He came on Sunday. She heard his horse from inside the sod house, and she was already putting the coffee on. He knocked at the door frame because the door was open, which she found correct and considerate. She showed him the claim. She was not modest about it. She showed him the things she was proud of with the plain pride of someone who has earned them. The fence line she had mended, the south field turning, the small vegetable garden alongside the house that was producing well, the barn with the roof that still needed work, which she showed him not as a problem to be solved but as the next thing on the list. The creek, which was running well in August and which she explained would thin in November and be back by March, and what she had done to plan around that timing. He walked beside her and listened with a quality of attention she had noticed in him from the beginning. Not the impatient listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the actual kind, the kind that registers what is said and keeps it. At the barn, he looked at the roof section that was bowing and said, "That's the top purlin. If you sister it now before the snow, you'll be fine." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "I need to get up there with a level to see how bad the sag is." "I'll come up," he said, "if you want an extra pair of hands." She looked at him. He was looking at the barn roof with the focused attention of someone making a practical assessment, but she could see from the angle of his jaw that he was also waiting for her answer and that it mattered to him. "Next Saturday morning," she said. "Bring the level." He came the next Saturday with a level and a bag of tools and the Guatemalan coffee again because they had apparently agreed on that, though neither of them had explicitly said so. They spent the morning on the roof, which was harder work than either of them made it sound, and by midday the purlin was sistered, and the sag was corrected, and Myrtle's shoulder was aching in a way that would be unpleasant by evening. She mentioned none of this. She made sandwiches from the bread she had baked that morning. She was a capable baker, which had surprised her when she discovered it, since her mother had not been, and they ate sitting on the low wooden fence outside the barn with their boots in the dust, and the sun coming strong and yellow from the south. He told her about Ohio. More than he had at dinner, the specific texture of it, the way his father's store had smelled, the way the Ohio winters were different from Wyoming winters in a way that was subtler than you'd expect, less dramatic but more relentless. He talked about the way he had felt constrained by the idea of inheriting a thing, not because the thing was bad, but because the inheriting of it meant you were a continuation of something rather than a beginning. He had needed to be a beginning. "My father understood," he said. "Eventually. My mother took longer." "Mothers often do," Myrtle said. "They build something in their minds about who you're going to be, and when you're something different they have to rebuild it. That takes time." "She's rebuilt it now," he said. "She says in her letters that she's proud." "She should be," Myrtle said. It came out simply, like a fact, and he looked at her with that expression, the recognition, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence was the most comfortable silence she had been in for years. September came. The barn roof held. The south field had been turned and the late-season cover crop was in. Myrtle's claim was on track, and her animals were well, and her stores were building for winter, and she was spending Saturday afternoons at the trading post in a way that had become a particular kind of gravity. She went there because she wanted to, and because he wanted her there, and because the space between those two things was narrowing in a way that felt neither frightening nor hasty but simply, quietly right. He kept the jar of creek plums on the shelf behind the counter through September and into October. She noticed and didn't say anything, but the noticing was its own kind of conversation. In October, on a Saturday afternoon when the air had gone cold and the light was going thin and pale, Gilbert closed the trading post early, which he almost never did, and he walked her out to the cottonwood grove by the creek, which was in its full autumn color, every leaf a different shade of gold, and the creek running low but still running, still present, still reliable enough to matter. He stopped walking when they reached the edge of the grove, and he turned to her, and she could see from the way he was standing that he had something to say that he had been thinking about carefully. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask you to consider being with me," he said. "Not as a matter of convenience or practicality. I know you don't need anyone to manage your claim or make decisions for you, and I'm not offering to do either." He paused, ordering his words. "I'm asking because you are the most interesting person I have met in my adult life, because you are honest and capable, and you notice things that other people miss, and you say them without apology. Because when you walked into the trading post in May and told me my price was wrong, something that had been asleep in me woke up, and I have not been able to convince it to go back to sleep." She looked at him. The cottonwood leaves moved in the cold October wind, and the creek ran softly behind her. "Gilbert," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like the completion of something. "I know it's soon," he said. "I know your loss is not old. I know it's not too soon," she said. It's been 6 years since Edmund was well. It's been a year since I stopped grieving and started living again. I know the difference." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking about this too. I'm not someone who says things she hasn't thought through." "I know," he said. "Then you know what I'm going to say," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd rather hear you say it," he said. She stepped toward him. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was familiar in the way that something can be familiar even when you're doing it for the first time. "Yes," she said. "I want to be with you. I have wanted to for months. I have just been careful about it, because being careful is what I do." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his jaw. He held it there for a moment, and then he turned his head very slightly so that his lips brushed the inside of her wrist, which was a more intimate gesture than a kiss on the cheek would have been, because it was specific and quiet, and his rather than any standard form. Myrtle felt it from her wrist to the center of her chest, and she did not try to contain the feeling, because she had learned that containing things did not make them smaller, only more compressed. He kissed her then, properly, in the October cottonwood grove with the gold leaves coming down around them and the creek running low below, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable, and when they came apart, she felt the Colorado wind on her face and the solid warmth of him at arm's length, and she thought, quietly and with her whole self, yes. They were formally engaged by November, which in Caldwell Creek meant that the announcement was made at the post office counter by the postmistress, Mrs. Aldrich, who had been waiting for this particular piece of news with the patience of someone who had seen it coming for months. The town responded with the particular enthusiastic approval of small communities that invest in the happiness of their members, and for 2 weeks there was a lot of congratulation, and several offered recipes, and at least 3 opinions about the correct date for a winter wedding in Wyoming, all of which were delivered with the firm certainty of personal authority. Myrtle received all of it with her characteristic grace, warm, direct, not embarrassed by happiness. She wrote to her sister in Missouri, and her sister wrote back immediately with a letter that took 11 days to arrive and contained, in addition to congratulations, a somewhat pointed inventory of questions about Gilbert that Myrtle answered in full on the grounds that her sister had earned the right to ask them. Gilbert wrote to his mother in Ohio. His mother wrote back in 3 weeks, which was fast, and her letter was warm in a restrained way that Gilbert translated for Myrtle as enthusiastic approval in his mother's particular register. She asked whether Myrtle would consider Ohio for a visit in the spring, which they both took as a good sign. The wedding was on the first Saturday of December, 1879, at the Caldwell Creek Church, which was a modest building that nevertheless looked very well in the thin December light, when the women of the congregation had finished decorating it with pine boughs and the dried late wildflowers that someone had been putting up all summer for exactly this kind of occasion. Myrtle wore a dress that was not the dark blue one. Her neighbor Clara Hennessy, whose baby had arrived in September, a healthy boy named Thomas James, who had all the vigorous opinions of someone who had been waiting impatiently to arrive, had worked with her for 3 weeks on a cream-colored wool dress that was simple and correct and made Myrtle look like herself, only on purpose, only fully arrived. Clara had cried while hemming it. Myrtle had not, but she had held Clara's hand for a moment, because they understood each other about things that were hard and things that were worth it. Gilbert stood at the front of the church in a good dark suit that he had ordered from the tailor in Cheyenne, and that had arrived with 3 days to spare. And when Myrtle came through the door, he looked at her the way she had seen him look at things. He found genuinely excellent, focused, full, without pretense. And she walked the length of the church toward him with the particular confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she is going. The minister was a steady man named Reverend Carr, who had been in Caldwell Creek for 5 years, and who knew both of them well enough to perform the ceremony with warmth and specificity rather than generic solemnity. The vows were the traditional ones, because they were both people who believed in the weight of the traditional form. The commitment it named was real, and they said it plainly and meant every word. When it was done, when they were pronounced husband and wife, and the congregation applauded with the full-hearted enthusiasm of people who had been invested in this outcome since May, Gilbert looked at her and said very quietly, for her alone, "You can come back any time." It was a reference to the beginning, to the first day, to the moment everything started, and she laughed, a real laugh, open and warm, because he had found exactly the right thing to say, which was what she had come to expect from him. The reception at the hotel was a proper event. Mrs. Aldrich had organized it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and there was food that was impressive given the December limitations of the frontier, and the Belmore Ranch foreman played fiddle, and people danced. Myrtle danced with her husband. She was going to be a long time getting used to the sound of that word, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt so specifically and surprisingly right. And he was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him, and he said dryly that there had been little else to do in Ohio on winter evenings, which made her laugh again. They danced until people began to drift away into the December night, and then they went home. Not to the claim alone, not to the trading post alone, but to a question they had been practical about and that they now had to answer: where, specifically, the two of them were going to live. They had talked about it. The pragmatics were clear in some ways. The trading post had attached living quarters, a proper room behind the storefront that Gilbert had been living in for 3 years, which was adequate for one person and small for two. The claim was 4 miles out of town and had the sod house Myrtle had built, which was also adequate for one person and perfectly comfortable for two, but was a significant commute from the trading post. What they settled on, over the course of several practical conversations in October and November, was a plan. They would spend the winter in the trading post quarters while Gilbert rebuilt the back section of the post to add a proper second room. And in spring, when the ground was ready, they would begin building a proper house on the claim, halfway between the creek and the south field, in the spot Myrtle had identified as ideal the previous spring, and had filed away without knowing yet why it would matter. The trading post quarters in the winter were cozy in the way small spaces become cozy when they are shared, warm, full of the small negotiations of proximity that are entirely different from the negotiations they both conducted in business, softer and more immediate, and requiring a different kind of flexibility. They learned each other in the way that people who have been careful all their lives learn new things deliberately, with attention, appreciating every detail. He made coffee in the mornings with the Guatemalan beans, and she made biscuits, which she had discovered she was good at, and they ate breakfast together before he opened the post, and she rode out to the claim to manage the winter tasks that still required regular attention. She was back by early afternoon most days, and she spent the afternoons in the post sometimes, reading or writing letters or working on the accounts, which she had taken over from Gilbert with his complete and immediate relief, because he was brilliant at the trading side and moderately competent at the record-keeping, and she was brilliant at both, and the division of labor was natural and satisfying to both of them. The winter was cold. Wyoming winters had no interest in being gentle, but it was not a hard winter in the way that frontier winters could be hard. The snow came predictably, and the creek stayed manageable, and the claim animals were well wintered in the barn with the repaired roof. Myrtle had planned for winter with enough care that there was nothing urgent to address, which left room for the kind of settled daily happiness that she was discovering was different from the dramatic happiness of falling in love, and quieter, and in its own way, deeper. She was, she understood, the happiest she had been since before Edmund got sick. Not instead of that love, but after it, separately and genuinely, the way the creek ran again after November, different in its character, the same in its essential nature, returning because that was what living things did when the conditions were right. She told Gilbert this one evening in December when they were sitting by the iron stove with the wind outside making the trading post creak. She told him about Edmund plainly and with the same honesty she brought to everything, because she believed he deserved to know the whole geography of her heart, not only the current topography. He listened with the full, specific attention she had come to love in him. He didn't flinch from the hearing of it. When she finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me all of it," which was exactly the right thing, neither making too much of it nor too little, just acknowledging that she had trusted him with something that mattered and he received it as such. "He would have liked you," she said. "Edmund, he had no patience for pretense either." "I hope so," Gilbert said. He paused. "I know you loved him." "I did," she said, "and I love you." The two things are true at the same time, and neither one diminishes the other. He reached across and took her hand, and that was all, and it was enough. In January, a letter arrived from Myrtle's sister Margaret in Missouri, written in the warm and slightly overwrought style that was entirely Margaret's own, containing news that their brother James had taken ill, nothing life-threatening. The doctors were optimistic, but significant enough that Margaret was asking whether Myrtle might be able to come. Myrtle read the letter twice and then showed it to Gilbert without comment. He read it. "Do you want to go?" he said. "I want to know James is all right," she said. "I don't know if going is practical. The claim, Tom Hennessy can manage the claim check for 6 weeks," he said. "He owes us a considerable favor and he'd consider it paid." "The post, Charlie's been ready for more responsibility for a year," he said. "I can manage this." She looked at him. "You're telling me to go." "I'm telling you the obstacles aren't the size you're making them," he said. "If you want to go, go. If you don't, don't. But don't decide based on problems that can be solved." She thought about it. James was her youngest brother, 21, the baby of the family, and he had always been the one she worried about. "I want to go," she said. "Then go," he said. "I'll be here when you get back." She went. The trip to Missouri was 3 days by train from Cheyenne, which she reached by stage, and the whole journey was a reminder of how far she had moved from the world she grew up in. Missouri in January was gray and bare and smelled like river mud and wood smoke, and her sister's house was warm and full of family noise in a way that was both exactly what she remembered and faintly exhausting. James was sick but improving, as the doctors had said. He was 21 and strong, and irritated by illness in the way that young men are irritated by anything that slows them down, which Myrtle found heartening. She spent 3 weeks, not 6, because 3 weeks was what James needed and 6 would have been what Margaret's anxiety needed, and those were two different things. She helped manage the household. She visited with her brother. She sat with him in the evenings and talked about Wyoming in the way that made him listen, the way that the particular freedom and difficulty of the frontier always made people who hadn't seen it listen. She wrote to Gilbert every week. He wrote back. His letters were like him, direct and specific and warm in the particular way that warmth could be contained in practical language. He told her the post was doing well and that Charlie was managing admirably. He told her that Tom Hennessy had checked the claim twice and that the Southfield fence line was holding. He told her that Mrs. Aldrich had asked after her at least 4 times, and that the Belmore Ranch foreman had asked whether she would be back before spring, because he wanted to discuss a business arrangement involving the Creek Basin land, which Gilbert was handling, but which he wanted her input on. He told her he missed her, which he said once, near the end of one letter, without elaboration, as though the statement was self-sufficient and required none. She read it twice and then put it in the box she kept letters in and thought about it quietly for a day before writing back. She came home in February. The stage from Cheyenne arrived at Caldwell Creek in the early afternoon of a day that was cold but windless, which in Wyoming in February counted as almost pleasant, and when she climbed down from the stage, Gilbert was standing in front of the trading post across the street. He had seen the stage arrive. He was standing with his arms at his sides and looking at her with the full, direct attention he always gave the things he cared about most, and she walked across the street toward him through the cold, quiet afternoon of Caldwell Creek. And when she reached him, she put her arms around him without preamble and held on. And he held her back with the particular thoroughness of someone who has been waiting for a thing, and is not interested in being restrained about it now that the thing has arrived. "James is better," she said into his shoulder. "Good," he said into her hair. They stood there on the main street of Caldwell Creek in February, until someone walking by made a polite and unnecessary coughing sound, which they both ignored. Spring came with the usual Wyoming combination of hope and aggression, warm days that smelled like new grass and cold nights that reminded you winter had not entirely agreed to leave. The creek rose with the snowmelt and ran fast and loud for 6 weeks, and then settled into its reliable summer character. And Myrtle stood at the edge of her south field in April, and looked at what she had built, and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has made a good decision and worked it into something real. They started the house in May. Not alone, Gilbert hired a crew of 4 for the framing, which went up in 2 weeks, and then the 2 of them finished the interior work themselves over the following month. Myrtle plastered the interior walls, which she had never done before and learned from a pamphlet and several mistakes, and Gilbert built the kitchen shelving with the precise and slightly perfectionist attention he brought to anything structural. The house was not large, but it was good 2 rooms on the ground floor and a sleeping loft above, with windows that faced the creek and the south field, because Myrtle had always wanted to be able to see both from inside. It had a proper iron stove for the kitchen and a smaller cast iron heater for the main room, and a root cellar that Gilbert had designed with the same systematic logic he applied to his pricing, accounting for every category of winter storage. They moved in on the 1st of July, 1880, exactly 1 year after the morning they had ridden together to save the Hennessy claim. The anniversary was not lost on either of them. Charlie Whitfield, who had been running the trading post during the house-building month with such competent independence that Gilbert had offered him a formal partnership stake, came to help with the moving, which was not a large job because neither of them owned more than they needed. Tom and Clara Hennessy came too, with baby Thomas James, who at 10 months had developed strong opinions about everything and was demonstrating them continuously from a wooden crate padded with Clara's shawl. It was a warm July afternoon, and they worked and talked and ate the food that Clara and Myrtle had prepared, and afterward they sat outside the new house in the long summer evening, and the men talked about the business of the territory, and the women talked about Clara's next pregnancy, which was confirmed, and which Clara was managing with cheerful practicality, and Thomas James fell asleep on a blanket on the grass, and the Caldwell Creek evening smelled like hay and cottonwood and the creek running nearby. Myrtle looked at Gilbert across the gathering, and he was already looking at her, and the look between them in the long July light was the kind of look that contains everything that has happened and everything still to come, and it was not desperate or searching because it had already found what it was looking for. They discovered Myrtle was expecting their first child in August, which the doctor in Caldwell Creek confirmed with the pleasant efficiency of a man who had delivered most of the current generation of Caldwell Creek children. Myrtle received the news with the particular steady joy of a woman who has wanted something and prepared for it, and understood what it would cost and decided it was worth every cent. Gilbert, when she told him, was quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when something mattered deeply, and then he did something she had not expected. He sat down in the chair at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he looked up his eyes were bright. "I didn't know I wanted this as much as I apparently do," he said, with the rueful honesty that she loved in him. "I know," she said. She sat down across from him and took his hands. "I was the same way when the doctor said it." She wrote to Margaret. Gilbert wrote to his mother and sister. The letters that came back were enthusiastic in the various registers of each writer, which was to say Margaret's letter was 11 pages of questions and opinions and genuine love, and Gilbert's mother's letter was 4 pages of specific practical advice and barely contained delight. The pregnancy was not without difficulty. The Wyoming winter was hard that year, harder than the previous year. The kind of winter that the territory produced periodically to remind everyone that Wyoming had no permanent agreement to be hospitable. Myrtle managed it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, staying warm, eating well, letting Gilbert manage more of the physical work without comment, which cost her something but was worth it. She was uncomfortable by February, not sick, not frightened, just physically aware of carrying a new person in a way that had changed the entire character of her body and demanded constant negotiation with it. Gilbert checked on her with such consistent and unobtrusive care that she was sometimes deeply moved by it, and sometimes wanted to tell him that she was fine and had been fine all her life. And instead she said neither thing and simply appreciated it, because she was learning that being cared for was not the same as being doubted, and that receiving care gracefully was its own kind of strength. The baby came in April of 1881, on a morning when the snow was finally fully gone, and the creek was running high, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to come into their spring green. The doctor came out from town, and Clara Hennessy came because she had asked to, and Myrtle had said yes, and Gilbert spent the morning in the main room below being resolutely calm in the way that people are resolutely calm when they are actively terrified, but have decided that terror is not useful. The baby was a boy. He arrived with the vigorous and indignant certainty of a person who has important things to do and has been waiting impatiently, and he had Gilbert's coloring and Myrtle's expression, which was to say he looked already like someone who would not miss much. They named him Robert William Graves. Robert for Gilbert's father, who had died the previous autumn at the end of a long and well-lived life, and William for Myrtle's father, who was still alive in Missouri and who cried, when he eventually heard the news, in the quiet private way of men of his generation who felt things deeply and said little. Gilbert held his son for the first time standing in the bedroom of the house they had built together, the April light coming through the window that faced the creek, and he looked at Myrtle with an expression that had all the previous expressions in it. The recognition, the respect, the specific warmth that was hers, plus something new that she didn't have a name for yet. Something that had to do with the particular astonishment of discovering that the life you built is more than you knew how to want when you started building it. Robert William, he said. Robert William, she said. Robert William had opinions from the beginning, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He was a loud and healthy baby who became a curious and tenacious infant, and then a stubborn, bright, joyful toddler who inherited his mother's mathematical precision and his father's systematic approach to problems, and who at 2 years old was already conducting small experiments on the behavior of water in the creek basin that Myrtle supervised with straight-faced scientific seriousness, and Gilbert watched from the bank, with the helpless affection of a man who recognizes himself in someone very small. Charlie Whitfield had become a full partner in the trading post by 1882, which freed Gilbert to spend more time on the claim, which had expanded. Myrtle had applied for a second adjacent claim through the Desert Land Act of 1877, which allowed settlers to claim additional land in arid territories if they could demonstrate irrigation, and she had demonstrated it, because she had spent 1880 building an irrigation system off the creek that was the most methodical engineering project the southern portion of Caldwell Creek Basin had ever seen. The second claim gave them an additional 320 acres, and with it they had planted more seriously a proper hay crop, some trial wheat, the continuation of the vegetable garden that had expanded from a kitchen garden to something that supplied more than just their own household. The trading post continued to thrive. Gilbert's reputation in the territory had grown in a way that was partly about business and partly about character, because he had been the man who had said no to Deckard Foss and protected his customers' information, And that kind of thing became part of the story people told about a place. The Post had grown to carry things that the Caldwell Creek of 3 years ago would have considered aspirational. A wider selection of seed stock, tools of quality that the Cheyenne market was beginning to supply with more regularity as the railroads expanded their reach, books that Gilbert ordered from an Eastern supplier every season. Myrtle's involvement in the Post was not formal. She had her claim, and it was her first commitment, but it was real and recognized. She handled the accounts, she corresponded with suppliers on quality and pricing matters, and she had a standing consultation arrangement with Gilbert on major buying decisions that was less a business formality than a natural extension of the way they talked about everything. She had opinions about the Cheyenne suppliers that were frequently more accurate than the supplier's own salesmen knew, because she read the trade newspapers and the agricultural journals and the federal land reports, and connected them in ways that gave her a view of market conditions that most people operating at the frontier level didn't have access to. The territory was changing. The railroads were pushing further into Wyoming, and with them came more settlers and more complexity, and more of the collisions between established communities and new arrivals that characterized the frontier in its later stages. Myrtle watched it with the same attention she brought to everything, and she talked about it with Gilbert in the evenings after Robert was in bed, and they both understood that the world they had built their life in was becoming something different, and that how they navigated that difference would matter. In 1883, Caldwell Creek got its first proper newspaper, edited by a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had come from Chicago and who had opinions about everything and the rhetorical facility to publish them twice weekly. Eleanor and Myrtle became friends in the way that two particular kinds of women became friends on the frontier immediately, without excessive ceremony, on the basis of mutual recognition. Eleanor wrote, in her first month of publication, a profile of the Graves Trading Post and its owners that was generous without being sentimental, and that noted, in a line Myrtle read twice, that the Post's success was in no small part due to the unusually sophisticated financial management and supplier relations overseen by Mrs. Myrtle Graves, who brought a combination of mathematical precision and market knowledge that was, in the editor's assessment, exceptional by any standard. Gilbert read the piece and put the newspaper on the counter in the Post and did not move it for a week, which was how she knew he was proud of it. She didn't say anything about this, because she knew him by now, and she understood that saying something would make him quietly uncomfortable, and that not saying something was a way of honoring the feeling while letting it be his. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1884. Another boy, which Myrtle announced to Clara Hennessy, who had 3 children now and had developed an expert's confidence about these things, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose family is taking the shape it was meant to take. They named him James Arthur Graves, James for Myrtle's brother, who had been healthy and well since 1880 and who had come to visit Wyoming the previous summer, and had spent 2 weeks being astonished by the landscape and the freedom and the scale of it, in the way that people from closer, greener places were always astonished by Wyoming. James Arthur had his mother's hair and his father's steadiness, and from very early he had a quality of attention quiet, focused, taking things in that was recognizably Gilbert's, translated into something softer and more patient. Robert, who was 3 when his brother arrived, was uncertain about the arrangement for approximately 2 weeks, and then decided James was acceptable, and subsequently adopted the protective certainty about him that he would carry his whole life. The Graves household on the Creek Basin claim was by 1880 for a busy place, not loud in the overwhelming way, but full of the specific productive noise of a life that is well and actively lived. There were animals and a garden and 2 small boys and the ongoing practical work of the claim and the back and forth to the trading post and the letters from Ohio and Missouri and the regular visits from the Hennesseys and from Charlie Whitfield, who had married a woman named Ada from Laramie and who now had a daughter of his own. There was Eleanor Vance and her newspaper and the opinions it generated, which provided excellent dinner conversation. There was the Caldwell Creek School, which had opened in 1882 and which Robert would attend beginning in the fall, and which Myrtle had been involved in establishing because she believed in schools with the same conviction her mother had and for the same reasons. There was also, still and always, the two of them, Myrtle and Gilbert, at the end of each day, in the house they had built with its windows facing the creek. She kept the books with the same precision her mother had taught her. He ran the post with the same systematic fairness he had always operated by. They negotiated still, on occasion business matters, household decisions, the complex logistics of managing a claim and a trading post and two small boys simultaneously. And they were well matched in it, as they had always been, and occasionally one of them won a round, and there was a particular pleasure in that, on both sides, because being matched was the thing they had each been looking for without quite knowing it. She came back to the trading post often. She came back every week in various capacities, bringing the accounts, consulting on orders, bringing Robert to show him how a business was run, stopping in because it was on the way, stopping in because she wanted to. She came back as a business partner, and as the person who ran the accounts, and as a neighbor, and as a friend of every customer in the place, and as the woman who had, in May of 1879, walked in with a specific arithmetic problem and changed everything. He said sometimes in the private language of their life together, when she had done something that impressed him, or when she was leaving the post after a long afternoon, or sometimes for no reason except that it was true, "You can come back any time." She always did. In the summer of 1885, Gilbert received a letter from his sister in Ohio. His sister's name was Frances, and she was 28 years old and unmarried, and the letter said that she was thinking about coming west. Not to visit, Frances was specific, but to stay. She had skills, she wrote. She could teach. She had heard from their mother's letters about Myrtle that Wyoming had a school, and she had been corresponding with a school board in Laramie about a position, and had been told the position was available if she could come by September. Gilbert showed Myrtle the letter. Myrtle read it carefully. "She sounds like you," she said. "She needs to be a beginning." "She's been ready to leave Ohio for 3 years," he said. Was waiting for a reason that felt possible. "Write her," Myrtle said. "Tell her to come. She can stay in the claim sod house until she's settled in Laramie." He looked at her. "That's generous." "It's practical," she said. "The sod house is standing empty, and it's good shelter, and it's 4 miles closer to Laramie than town is. It makes sense." She paused. "Also, I'd like to know your sister." Frances Graves arrived in August on the same stage line that had brought Myrtle home from Missouri in 1880. She was brown-haired and direct-eyed and had the Graves quality of saying things without excess cushioning, and Myrtle liked her immediately, which was both unsurprising and satisfying. She spent 3 weeks at the sod house on the claim before taking up her position in Laramie, and in those 3 weeks she taught Robert his letters with an efficiency that made Myrtle suspect she would be an excellent school teacher, and she helped in the garden, and she sat up late talking with Myrtle about Ohio and Missouri and the particular experience of women who wanted things and had to build the infrastructure to get them. "Gilbert's different," Frances said one evening. "Since Wyoming. Since you." "How so?" Myrtle asked. "He smiles," Frances said. "Not often, but when something genuinely pleases him, he smiles now. He didn't do that before." She paused. "I always thought it was in there somewhere. He needed someone who could get it out." Myrtle thought about the first day in the trading post, about the specific moment when Gilbert Graves had set the saddle oil on the counter and said, "You can come back any time," in a voice that surprised him as much as it surprised her. "I wasn't trying to get anything out," she said. "I was just being accurate." "That's what got it out," Frances said. "He trusts accurate people." He'd never met one who was also. She stopped. "Also what?" Myrtle said. "Warm," Frances said. He'd met accurate people who were cold and warm people who were imprecise. You're both. Myrtle was quiet for a moment. He is too, she said. Frances smiled. I know, she said. That's the point. The years moved in the way that good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular fullness that means every season has been used and nothing important has been wasted. Robert started school in the fall of 1885 and was immediately the most argumentative student in the class, which the teacher handled with impressive equanimity, and which Myrtle handled by giving him harder arithmetic problems at home. So he had something more demanding to think about than arguing with the curriculum. James Arthur was a steadier student when his time came, quieter, more methodical, more interested in how things worked than in whether they were being explained correctly, which was his father in miniature, and which made Gilbert visibly happy in the restrained way that was his particular form of emotional display. Frances had settled in Laramie and was becoming known as an excellent teacher, which Myrtle heard from multiple sources in the way that genuine talent generates multiple independent witnesses. She came to Caldwell Creek for Christmases and for the summers, and the visits were warm and easy and full of the particular comfortable noise of a family that has expanded without losing coherence. In 1887, there was another child, this time a girl, which Myrtle received with equal joy. They named her Clara Frances Graves, Clara for Clara Hennessy, who had been there from the beginning and whose friendship had been one of the constants of Myrtle's Wyoming life, and Frances for her sister-in-law, who received the honor with more visible emotion than was entirely characteristic, and who came from Laramie specifically to meet the baby, and who sat holding her for an entire afternoon in the kitchen of the Creek Basin house, with an expression of complete absorption. Clara Frances had both her parents in her mother's dark eyes and her father's auburn coloring, and from very early, a combination of mathematical interest and human warmth that made the adults around her feel simultaneously reassured and slightly outmatched. She was going to be formidable. Myrtle could see it from the first month. She was not in the least sorry about this. The trading post in 1887 was a different enterprise from what it had been in 1879. Charlie Whitfield managed it with the same systematic competence Gilbert had installed, and Gilbert's active involvement had shifted from daily management to the larger strategic decisions, supplier relationships, expansion of the credit system, the response to the growing complexity of the territorial economy as Wyoming moved toward statehood. Myrtle remained the accounts, as she had always been, and she remained the quality control on major financial decisions, as she had also always been, and the division of labor between the two of them continued to be the most efficient arrangement either of them had ever participated in. In 1890, Wyoming became a state. It was the first state admitted to the Union with women's suffrage written into its constitution, because Wyoming Territory had granted women the vote in 1869, 21 years earlier, on the grounds that Wyoming needed capable people, and capable people came in multiple genders, and it was not practical to waste them. Myrtle had voted in every territorial election since she arrived. She voted in the first state election in November of 1890 with Robert, who was 9, standing beside her, and she explained to him what the vote meant and why it had not come easily, and why it mattered that Wyoming had held it even when the federal government had suggested it should be relinquished. And Robert listened with the focused attention of a child who is being told something important and knows it. James Arthur was 6. Clara Frances was 3. The Graves household on the Creek Basin was full and well, and rooted deep in the Wyoming ground. On the evening of Wyoming statehood, Gilbert and Myrtle sat on the porch of the house they had built with the creek running below, and the first stars coming out above the bluffs to the west, and the 3 children were inside with the evening lamp lit, and the cottonwoods were in their late summer green, and everything was very quiet in the particular way of evenings that have been earned. "Do you remember," Gilbert said, "what you said the first time you saw the claim?" "I said the soil was good once you got through the top inch," she said. "You said it like it was already done," he said, "like you could see it finished." "I could," she said. "I could see the south field and the fence line and the irrigation and the house. I could see all of it." "You didn't tell me that," he said. "I told you what was relevant," she said. "The rest I thought it better to show." He was quiet, looking at the last of the light on the bluffs. "You've shown me more than I knew how to look for," he said. It was said with his particular direct simplicity, with no cushioning and no performance, and she felt it arrive with the specific accuracy of something aimed and true. She reached across and took his hand. The creek ran below, and the stars came out one by one above the Wyoming bluffs, and the lamp burned warm in the window behind them. She had come back to the trading post in May of 1879 with a practical argument and a piece of arithmetic and no intention of changing anything except the price of a hide. She had come back for wire in June, and for nothing in particular in July, and for specific and practical reasons in every subsequent month for the 11 years since. She came back because he had said she could and meant it, and because she had discovered over those 11 years that the trading post and the man behind the counter and the life they had built out of their particular combination of precision and warmth and stubbornness and attention was the thing she had been heading toward without knowing it. The way water moves toward the lowest point not because it has chosen to, but because that is what it is made to do. She had beaten him at his own negotiation on the first day, which was not something that happened to Gilbert Graves, and he had not been angry, and that had been the beginning of everything. She thought about it sometimes, the strange specific alchemy of that first morning, the closed dry goods store, the ride across town, the arithmetic problem that turned into the opening line of the most important conversation of her life. The way he had said you can come back any time and surprised himself with it. The way she had surprised herself by thinking about it for 11 days before she went back. The way things turned on such small hinges. The way a single honest conversation in a frontier trading post between two careful people who had spent their adult lives learning to pay attention could become a house and a family and a creek running through it and a life that was, in every particular that counted, exactly right. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which he asked her occasionally in the evenings, not because she was hard to read but because he liked hearing her answers. She looked at the creek. She looked at the lamp in the window. She looked at him, at Gilbert Graves, who had come from Ohio to be a beginning and had found, on the first Tuesday of May in 1879, the thing that made him one. "I'm thinking about arithmetic," she said. He looked at her sidelong with the not-quite smile that had become, over 11 years, one of the things she loved most about him. Specifically the arithmetic of one good decision, she said, and what it's worth. He held her hand in the Wyoming evening, and the stars came fully out above the bluffs, and the creek ran below, and the children were warm inside the house. And Myrtle Graves, who had been Myrtle Hawkins, who had been the only woman who had ever beaten Gilbert Graves at his own game, who had come back any time he offered, and had built something from every return, sat beside her husband, and let the sum of it rest in her, complete and quiet and more than enough. More than enough. More than she had known to calculate for in the beginning, standing at the counter of a frontier trading post with her arithmetic in hand, and no idea, not the smallest idea, what she was about to open. She was glad she had walked through the door. She was glad she had said the price was wrong. She was glad she had come back. She was glad for all of it, every return, every conversation, every practical negotiation that was also something more, every morning of coffee and biscuits and accounts, and the specific, earned, irreplaceable dailiness of a life shared with someone who matched her. She was glad for the creek and the south field, and the house with windows facing the right direction, and the children inside with the lamp lit, and the man beside her with her hand in his. And in the morning she would ride into Caldwell Creek, and she would go to the trading post, because she had things to discuss about the spring supplier orders, and because Charlie Whitfield had a question about the accounts, and because she was always welcome there, had always been welcome there, since the first day Gilbert Graves had looked at her across his counter after losing, for the only time in his professional life, a negotiation he had thought was unlosable, and said, with the surprised honesty of a man discovering something he had been waiting for without knowing it, "You can come back any time." She always had. She always would. And that, in the end, was the whole of it, the sum total, the final accounting, the balance that came out exactly right.